Hello, I'm Alistair McIntyre. I'm the publisher of Electric Scotland. I really just thought I would tell you a little bit about the site so that you get a kind of an overview of what you might find here. Basically, the site was started back in 1997 in Scotland. I was living in Grangemouth in Stirlingshire at the time. And the web was still pretty new and there was no history of Scotland on the web. So I decided to create a whole website all to do with the history of Scotland and the Scots. My first major publication that went up was a 6-volume set, which was about the general history of the Highlands of Scotland, the Highland clans and the Highland regiments. And it was actually Jimmy Thin in Edinburgh, the booksellers, who actually found me that set. And I started to read it, and it was a great read. I mean, it was very interesting, most enjoyable, and I learned a lot from that. So that whole 6-volume set is actually now up on the site. When I completed that, I thought what I need to now do is start looking at the history of individual Scots. And in my searching, and remember back in these days we didn't have the luxury of internet archives or anything, so to find appropriate books to put on the site I had to go through antiquarian bookshops and just go through the shelves. But I was fortunate in finding the Dictionary of Eminent Scots. It was originally a 4-volume set, but at a later date a 5th volume was actually added to that. So I managed to get the 5-volume set, and that's now the basis of our famous Scots section. And what you learn in there is actually amazing. We've actually added to the famous Scots section over time because we find people that aren't in there but did something really significant, and we felt this should be included, so we've gradually added to that famous Scots section over the years. Having got that up, my attention was turning to what things might be like domestically in Scotland. And I was talking to a genealogist, and he said, you know, one of the books I said would be really good to put up is the Domestic Annals of Scotland. Now, if I remember right, that was a 3-volume set, but it was from basically 1531 to 1781. But he said, you know, you're going to get a lot of individuals mentioned in there, and he said, I think that would be great to make available. So I got the set, and that's up on the website as well. But it's quite interesting because by doing that set, I came across a reference that some 30,000 Scots had gone to fight for Germany. Well, of course, we'd come through 2 world wars at that point. I'm thinking, fought for Germany? What's going on here? And I mean, our population back in those days must have been about 1.5 million. So 30,000 Scots leaving was a very significant chunk of the population. And in the domestic annals, the women were wondering if any of the Scots would ever come back home. So by searching, I eventually found a complete book about the Scots in Germany. So through that book I learned an awful lot about what happened to those Scots. But equally, the author of that had also written about the Scots in East and West Prussia, and also the Scots in Poland. So these books are also up on the site. And some years later I found out that same author had actually written a book about the Scots in Sweden. So I managed to get that, and that's also up on the site. So as you can see, this was starting to kind of build to being almost like another complete story about what the Scots did when they left Scotland. And that's just an amazing story, and how they contributed to lands all over the world. I mean, I'm also trying to dig into what life could have been like in those days. So, for example, I put up a book about the Scots in Argentina. Later, I found a book about the Scots on the River Plate and their churches, which was also added to the site. But a few years later, I came across a book all about emigrating to Argentina. This is where a family back in Scotland decided that they were going to move to Argentina to get a ranch and build a whole new life there. And the detail I went into about the preparation for going, and then how they got there, and how they located the land, and how they decided to farm it and to get cattle onto it and build their house and build their life, just absolutely amazing. So that's gone onto the site. And likewise, as I started to go on to the Scots in the New World, America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and so forth. For example, in Canada, I was being told all the time, yeah, they got their lot, they went in, they cut down the trees, and they built their farms. But I thought, you know, there's got to be a lot more to it than that. And again, eventually I found some really good accounts of settlement, how people actually went about settling the land. In fact, there was one wee story where the grandson burst into the house and said to his grandfather, "Grandad, we've got the last stump out." Well, that's like 3 generations it took to get all the trees cut and the stumps out of the ground. That's one heck of a lot of work. And some of these books were going into very big detail about how they went through all that. I mean, even a simple thing like digging a well was a massive task, because in some parts, like in Prince Edward Island, they knew in the winter the water would freeze. So to get running water during the winter, they had to dig down deep, and that's where they built the wells. But building a well, I mean, not only do you have to dig all maybe 30 feet down, but you're also talking about putting stones in so the sides of the well wouldn't fall in. And even when you got to the top, they still had to build another 3 foot up from there so the wee kids wouldn't fall into the well. I mean, you just don't think of these things today, but it's fascinating when you go there. We've then continued to build the Scots in the World section, so we've now got a lot more countries in there. I mean, for example, we had the Scots Brigade in the Netherlands for 2 centuries. I never heard about that either, you know, totally amazing. But we've also started to do histories of individual places in Scotland. So, you know, you're going to find a lot of information about the Scots in Glasgow, in Edinburgh, in Dundee, in Aberdeen, in Inverness. We've dug deeper, and we've got books about the trade guilds that were in Scotland at the time. We've also done books about medicine, about the law, the legal system, about our churches. Because that's one of the things that the Scots really took all over the world, was the love of their church. And it's amazing, for example, in Canada, just one superintendent actually opened up literally hundreds of churches and schools, especially in the Northwest Territories. Totally amazing what that person did. But you see these stories all over the place. And so that's what we're trying to open up. We try to do histories of individual areas in Scotland, like small glens and what life was like in the glens. We also cover the Scots-Irish, because after all, the Scots-Irish came from Scotland to settle Ulster. And we have, for example, a full volume book about the history of Ulster on the side. And we've also got some of the proceedings of the Scots-Irish Association in America, which was formed in, I think, 1891. And these are very, very good accounts about Scots settlement in America. From there, we've widened our scope a bit. For example, we've got a very good poetry and stories section. Part of that was because I wanted to talk about Robert Burns and some of our other famous poets. And the Robert Burns section is now huge. For example, Frank Shaw, who's a real Burnsian, he's got over 100 articles on Robert Burns. His series is called Robert Burns Lives, and he's trying to show how Robert Burns is still relevant even today all over the world. And so he's done a pile of really great articles in there. Likewise, we've covered things like the Scots language. It's quite an old section of the site, because most of the recordings were in real audio, which some people might not have, but for example, we've got 3,000 of the Scottish words. Now, I should maybe explain that for about 3 centuries we had a genuine Scots language. It wasn't Gaelic, it was the Scots language. And for 3 centuries that was a language of the court in Scotland. And when you're going through a lot of the histories, you'll find references to acts that are actually in the Scots language. So we thought to help you with the Scots language, we would do audio recordings. So we have about 3,000 words in the glossary, and when you play one of the words, it'll say the word in Scots, it'll give you the English translation, and then it'll give you a sentence using that word in Scots with an English translation, and then it'll eventually say the word in Scots one more time. And that's some 3,000 words that we've recorded like that. But in addition, we've got stories and short poems, all in the Scots language, all recorded for you. So all of that is pretty good. We've also, because we were trying to get the kids involved in the site, we decided to make an effort to put children's stories up and a few wee games. For example, Dress the Chief is a very, very popular game. It's where you can take 3 different backgrounds and you bring in the trunk of the chief, you give him different heads, dress him in different tartans, you can bring his wife in, you bring his son and daughter in, and the dog, and even some sheep and stuff like that. So it's a kind of Dress the Chief game. But we also have built in about 800 children's stories, vast majority of which have some Scottish connection or a very detailed Scottish connection, and they are designed for the young ones and the not so young as well. For example, we have a series of stories which was trying to teach very young children a little of the history of Scotland, and so it was based with 2 butterflies flying around Scotland, and every time they settled, the boy butterfly, being the history buff, would relate a wee history story. And as I say, as we developed our poetry and stories section, a lot of visitors to the site would actually send in some of their own poems and their own stories, which actually were extraordinarily good, most of them. So we've built that up, and it's become a large chunk of the site as well. And we've got fairy stories and ghost stories and stuff like that. In our lifestyle section, we have Beth's Newfangled Family Tree, which is actually written down in the southern states, and it's mainly about the Scottish connections in there. And she goes to the Love of Highland Games and puts pictures into it. It's a PDF file that comes out once a month. We also point to the Flag in the Wind, which is a political commentary in the Scots Independent newspaper. They have been going for, I think, since I think it was April 1928. And so this is their online political journal, because obviously they're fighting for an independent Scotland, and so everything political is to do with independence, basically. But it certainly is an interesting read each week. We also do our own weekly newsletter, so that's actually posted up now in our community. We have an Elected Scotland community, which is forums, and so basically we post the newsletter up in the forum, and you can subscribe if you become a member of the community, which is free. You can actually subscribe to the forum, so when a new newsletter goes up, you get an email alert telling you that it's available. And the community is building because we have links to Facebook within it, so if you were to post a message in the community, you can check a box, so it will also be posted to your own wall on Facebook. And we also have a dynamic interface with YouTube, so if you posted a YouTube URL into a message, then when people view the message, the video will actually play within the message. So and we've also got maybe 300 arcade games within there, and the community is building steadily. We're also just about to embark on what we call the Lossiemouth project. It's a concept that we feel we wanted to bring an area of Scotland alive to people. The only problem with that is you have to get the locals involved. Unless the locals get involved, you just can't do it. But what my hope is that as we build the Lossiemouth project, a lot of the residents in that area will start to tell us about their own families and their own life in the area. And we hope to be able to profile local businesses and the local communities and everything. So that's maybe a section you want to keep your eye on. It's still in the very early stages of development, but we've already got a retired fishing boat captain that sent in some poems that he wrote, and he also wrote some sweet stories for his grandkids, and we've got some of those stories on the site already. The local golf club is going to get involved, we already know that, and so I think that's going to build to be something pretty fascinating. So that's really what Elected Scotland's all about. As I say, it's the history of Scotland and the Scots, but every bit as much about what the Scots did all over the world. So